Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor, and I'm joined today by Katy, Spectator's political editor, and Fraser, the editor of The Spectator. Now, we are 24 hours into Keir Starmer's government, and he has appointed his main cabinet roles, and they've held a meeting this morning. Katy, tell us about who's in, who's out. Were there any surprises?
Well, in some ways, we have continuity. You have the biggest jobs going to those we expected. As Keir Starmer made clear in the campaign, Angela Rayner is his deputy. In a way, she has to be. She is elected by the Labour membership, unlike anyone else. She is in some ways unsackable. Rachel Reeves is the Chancellor. She is the first female Chancellor, and we expected that to happen. David Lammy, despite some job speculation, is the Foreign Secretary. He has managed to stand off threats for now. And then you have Yvette Cooper in the Home Secretary job. And I think it shows that Keir Starmer wants continuity and he wants experience. In a way, the more interesting and surprising appointments are elsewhere.
And Fraser, there were some also surprise absences from the cabinet table this morning because of people who actually didn't make it in this election.
Yes, Thangam Debonair, who was lined up to be Culture Secretary, ended up losing her seat to the Greens. By the way, that was always on the margins. So we've now had Lisa Nandy put in her place. Now, Labour did have quite a detailed culture brief ready to go. No idea whether Lisa Nandy's appointment means that's now off the table. But what really jumped out at me was the appointment of James Timpson as Prisons Minister. Now, for two reasons. One, James Timpson is not an MP. He's been chief executive of Timpson's group for the last 20 years, so he'll have to be put in the House of Lords. But he has been chair of the Prisons Reform Trust, and he's got some very developed views on prisons. He gave an interview to Channel 4 recently, and we can have a look at some of the things he said.
In very crude terms, and you'll get people who completely disagree with me on this, we have 85,000 people in prison. It's going to go up to 100,000 pretty soon. A third of them should definitely be there. There's another third in the middle, which probably shouldn't be there, but they need some other kind of state support. A lot of them have got massive mental health issues. They've been in prison, in and out of prison all their lives. And then there's another third, and there's a large proportion of women. Prison is a disaster for them because they're just putting them back in the offending. I would just look at the evidence. So let me give you an example in Holland, which I know lots of people like to use the Dutch as an example. They've shut half their prisons, not because people are less naughty in Holland, it's because they've got a different way of sentencing, which is community sentencing. So people can stay at home, keep their jobs, keep their homes, keep reading their kids' bedtime stories. And it means that they're far less likely to commit crime again.
So there you are. He's basically holding up as an example Holland, saying, look, they shut half of their prisons. This is a good thing, he thinks, because, again, he says, a third of people in prisons should not be there. Only a third should be, he says, and another third is in the middle. Now, this points to a potentially radical solution by the Starmer government to the prison capacity crisis problem. I mean, we're about to run out of spaces in our prisons. This has been a problem building up and neglected by the Conservatives for some time. Now, could it be that what they're going to do now is to follow the advice of James Timpson, the new minister? Well, it's up to him, but is he going to be following the example of Holland and closing prisons and radically changing sentencing guidelines so that a third or even a half of prisoners are no longer in custodial sentences but serving community ones instead? So this is, to me, the single most interesting appointment Keir Starmer has made, appointing a non-politician with very fixed radical views on prisons and giving him the prisons portfolio.
I think it's fascinating. And I also think it's fascinating because Shabana Mahmood has been appointed as Justice Secretary. Now, she was Shadow Justice Secretary, and I interviewed her on my podcast, Women with Balls, just a couple of months ago. And I think you can hear this clip now.
There is no disguising the absolute mess that the Tories have made of not just the prison system, but the broader justice system. So the problems are bigger than just criminal justice, but criminal justice is obviously what impacts most on ordinary citizens. And prisons overcrowded, but also we just don't have enough places. I mean, this country hasn't built enough prison places for a long time, and certainly not for the last 14 years, where there have been quite dire warnings about the need for more prison capacity. But then you also have a courts backlog, which is, victims are trapped in that system for years on end waiting for resolution of their cases. But also if you're a defendant who's ultimately acquitted, you've spent a long time as well with your life on hold. And right in the middle of it, you've got a probation system that the government is asking to do more work, but it's basically on its knees. So let's be no doubt, they have totally car crashed this system.
That is Shabana Mahmood talking about how the Tories have gone soft on prisons, they are releasing too many prisoners, and ultimately talking about the problem of overcrowding, but suggesting because the Tories haven't built enough prisons, and one of Labour's policies, one of their big plans has been to build more prisons, partly through relaxing restrictions, they have led to this situation. So it's not that, I think the two views of Timpson and Mahmood are possibly, they can be aligned. I think that is something, but it would be quite tricky to go from Shabana Mahmood's rhetoric of every week blasting the Tories in the Commons chamber for overcrowding, for releasing prisoners, when they've done this thing, you can effectively through statutory instruments and, without a vote, release prisoners and change the number while you do it. And the Tories have kept doing that. Now, Labour may start doing this and blaming the Tory inheritance. But if they go for the argument of actually saying, to Fraser's point, this is a positive thing to do for these reasons, that's going to be quite a pivot from some of the rhetoric we've had when Labour were in opposition.
It's funny because why would you appoint James Timpson to that job if you weren't going to follow his agenda? I mean, there's a whole bunch of voices out there suggesting what you should be doing about prisoning and sentencing. And there's only one person, he's the main voice, the chair of the Prisons Reform Trust out there saying we need to cut by a third the number of prisoners. So why would you then put him into the House of Lords, make him prisons minister, if you weren't going to let him do what he's been very clear he believes needs to be done? So I am just fascinated to see how this drama will play out.
I also suspect James Timpson would not take this job unless he was assured he would have some sway, because this is someone with a very established career, a reputation in their own right. I was struck yesterday, there's lots of downbeat Tories. There are some upbeat Tories saying they can still see a path. But last night, when the James Timpson appointment was announced, it was just after Patrick Vallance was announced. So that is the former chief scientific officer who now is going to be a minister through a peerage in Ed Miliband's department. I would say that got a mixed response on my phone. James Timpson was announced. I had former cabinet members messaging me saying that's a fantastic appointment by Keir Starmer. And I think those on the Tory side think this is a very respected figure. So I think to convince that person to come in, they would have to be told they had to be more than just a yes man in a junior ministerial role.
And this is an entrepreneur, a really successful entrepreneur who's been known for his work on prisons, right? I mean, he famously, his chain employs former convicts and rehabilitated prisoners into their chain. So I think he's known for this. But Katy, on the Shabana Mahmood point, actually, in that interview that you did with her, another thing that she said was about how big her in tray would be when it comes to the waiting list in the court system, in the justice system, and how she really has to get her feet under the desk and basically see what's going on there. So I guess my question is, it's not as if now a Labour government has come in, everything's going to be fixed just because the people in charge are different. There's a lot of problems that they're going to have to start fixing. Fraser, what departments will you be looking at most in terms of to see whether or not Labour really can make a difference, or if it will just be the same as previously?
Well, Wes Streeting's got off to a flying start as Health Secretary. Within 2 hours of taking the job, he put out a statement saying that the operational premise of his department is that the NHS is broken. He went further and said that Labour's huge majority is a mandate by voters for reforming the NHS. Now, this is fighting talk. Make no mistake about that. Compare this to the previous Tory health secretaries who have positioned themselves as kind of pom-pom wavers for the NHS. I mean, Jeremy Hunt would go up to work with NHS lapel badge saying how much he liked the NHS. Wes Streeting is saying, of course, he likes it, but he is saying it is broken and it needs reform. So to me, this looks like the end of the road for Amanda Pritchard, the NHS chief executive. It wouldn't surprise me if Wes Streeting either fires her or suggests to her that she moves on. But he's also said he's going to talk to junior doctors, try to get them to resolve their strike. He's also said, by the way, he's going to reject their demand for a 35% pay rise. So I'm not quite sure how he's going to do that. But he certainly intends to make himself a reforming NHS director, more than just a health secretary. He is going to be reforming and changing the way our health system is run. He's also come back from Australia, Singapore, looking at other models. So we could be in for more NHS reform from Labour than we've ever had from the Conservatives. Now, the other area which I think is huge and the crisis is building is welfare. We know that disability allowance is absolutely surging. The number on disability allowance is going up by 1,000 a day and is projected to keep doing so for years to come unless there's a big change in the system. So Liz Kendall is the new DWP secretary. She verbally says she's a reformer, but is she really ready for the kind of trench warfare it will take to reform? Now, if Keir Starmer doesn't do this, it will cost him a fortune. The DWP has got these forecasts saying that the bills are going to go up by like £25 billion over the next in 5 years' time for both working age kids and for pensioners. That the disability bill is going to be absolutely huge unless they manage to reform that. So I can completely see why no new Prime Minister would want really to get stuck in with tough love welfare reform, which is one of the toughest things you can do in politics. But the welfare system is so badly broken that if he doesn't, then he's going to be footing bills which he absolutely can't afford. And more to the point, we're going to be having a sort of fake economic growth model that's going to be doing without the skills of something like 5 million people who are on out-of-work benefits now, at least 2 million of which probably could be working given the right support and given the right reform. Now, that's a huge opportunity. It doesn't quite have an agenda. West Streeting does have an agenda, and one I think he's going to lose no time in getting stuck into.
I think when it comes to Wes Streeting's mindset too, you have to remember he just had a brush with death. He nearly lost his seat. He only kept by a couple of hundred votes opposite the independent. And I think from my knowledge of Wes Streeting, this is probably going to encourage him further to be bold, to make the best of the time he has. Clearly, he's often talked of it as a potential successor to Keir Starmer. The heir, and they just need to find another spare. But effectively, I think this will just be a reminder that you cannot, particularly when you think about some of his colleagues who they expected to be there, Thang and Devanir, Jonathan Ashworth, who lost their seats to the Greens or Independents, that you cannot take anything for granted. And therefore, further, I think, crystallising the sense from speaking to a few Labour politicians since the result, which is they don't want to completely deviate and take the public by surprise, but this majority is a once-in-a-lifetime majority potentially for this Labour government. You don't normally see majorities going up at the second election. You don't know who's going to be around at the second election, and you don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of years. And I think, therefore, using the time now, this time where you're on a high, your capital's never really stronger. Keir Starmer's never going to have more of his own party and probably the press willing to give him the benefit of doubt. That I think if you want to be a reforming minister in this term, now is the time to really start getting your ducks in the row and pushing it. And the manifesto was pretty thin on what they might do in NHS reform. It talked about reform, but it didn't go into the details. And I think that Wes Streeting is clearly seeing the result as a mandate to act on the vague promise of reform and plans to push on with it. When it comes to welfare, I mean, Jonathan Ashworth previously held the brief before Liz Kendall. I don't think Liz Kendall has fleshed out publicly at least what they want to do, but I think there is an awareness within the Treasury and by Rachel Reeves that the welfare bill currently at this point is unsustainable. Now, this is going to be a thorny issue within Labour. I think there is an argument that the only party that can really reform the NHS is perhaps Labour, because it can have those difficult conversations, whereas the Tories start to do it and they get accused of trying to bring in a US-style health system. There's that kind of fear of privatisation. On welfare, in terms of the parliamentary party, I think welfare reform could be quite popular with the public. We've seen some of these measures, but the parliamentary party will be trickier on some of these things. And you think about the 2-child limit, really controversial, the benefit limit that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer at the time said they were going to keep it. They said they were going to keep it during the election. Yet you speak to Labour MPs and lots of them say, well, obviously they're just saying that to get in. They don't really mean it. So I think that would be one of the first tests when it comes to, and obviously there's a lot more to do there, but they have the space to do it. It just will be one which I think will be uphill in terms of the views of some in the party if they do decide to, follow the footsteps of Purnell and others in going there. And then I think, just final reflections looking at that the cabinet so far was still to get lots of the junior ministerial roles. And I think this is where you might get some of, this huge parliamentary party, all these new MPs. You've got some, yes, we mentioned Douglas Alexander already, but, Hamish Faulkner, son of Charlie Faulkner, former cabinet minister, already talked about as, a Labour prince. I'm not sure he wants to be called a Labour prince. Lots of rising stars, lots of Labour MPs who, the so-called Starmtroopers, who have given up quite serious jobs. There's a vaccine scientist in there, others. And I think, we'll start to see whether it's junior ministerial roles or PPS roles, how they start to, promoting the next rung of Labour politicians of the future. And, Patrick Vallance, what will he bring to the table? I think he's in Ed Miliband's department, of course, and that's going to be one of the most interesting ones because they have a very ambitious agenda that I think there's right to be sceptical of how much they can achieve when it comes to power grid, clean energy by 2030. Is that going to be perhaps the albatross around Keir Starmer's neck if they don't manage to do it? And Ed Miliband has often been positioning himself in a way that is difficult for the Treasury, the shadow Treasury at the time, because he wants to be more ambitious, whereas they want to be cautious. In opposition, I think you can say the shadow Treasury has won most of its fights. Will Rachel Reeves be able to keep that up now she is in government?
Fascinating. They're going to actually have to start governing. Katy and Fraser, thanks very much. And stick with us with Spectator TV as we bring you further reporting along the government's way.